Hello, Internet. It's Mike, sporting my latest in COVID hair. Strange times we are living in for sure. Well, I'm here to talk to you about racism. Oh, I know what you're thinking already. You're probably thinking, what's an old white guy like you know about racism? Well, it turns out I know quite a bit about it because I am a racist. And who better to talk about racism than someone who has known it and seen it from the inside? I first realized that I was racist back in about the late 1990s. I was working as a software engineer in the uber white suburb of St. Louis Park, just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was on my way to work one day, and I got into the elevator heading up towards my office when in behind me came three young black guys. I was immediately so uncomfortable that I had to stop and ask myself what the discomfort was all about. And I didn't have an easy or immediate answer to that question. I scanned my memory and I couldn't come up with a single instance of ever having a negative experience of a person of color in my entire life. In fact, the relatively limited experiences I had had with people of color were all very positive. So the discomfort I was feeling in the elevator that day was clearly not triggered by anything black people had ever done. And the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. And the more it bothered me, the more I began to notice not so subtle racism that was all around me. It was everywhere. For example, I started to be able to tell if a news story that I was watching on TV was being reported about a crime committed by a white person or a person of color simply by the wording that they used in the headline, with white suspects oftentimes being treated better than their black victims. Don't believe me? Check out some examples of headlines that have been compiled by the Huffington Post. Like this headline about a white suspect in a triple homicide. Quote, Alabama suspect, brilliant, but a social misfit. Compare that to this black victim in a headline. Quote, Montgomery's latest homicide victim had histories of narcotics abuse, tangles with the law. Or how about this headline about a white guy who killed his parents? Quote, son in Staten Island murders was brilliant, athletic, but his demons were the death of his parents. In case you missed it there, the headline puts the responsibility of the murders on the white guy's so-called demons rather than on himself. Also notice the emphasis on his good qualities. In fact, the headline leads with those. Compare that to this headline about a black victim whom we've all heard about. Quote, Trayvon Martin was suspended 3 times from school. Really? Are you kidding me? Is there any reason we needed to know about Trayvon Martin's school suspensions? Or how about this one? Remember, this is a headline about a victim. Police say slain Lakeland teen had been shot before. That death possibly drug-related. It's almost as if they're suggesting that he deserved to be shot, and that being shot wasn't why he died. Anyway, I could go on with headlines like these. Fortunately, I don't have to, because some media outlets have recently begun to notice too and have started documenting the extreme disparity between how white people are portrayed in the press compared to the way people of color are. Do some Googling around, you'll see what I mean. It's really just shocking. And it's not just headlines and news stories. The way white people are portrayed in movies and TV shows is drastically different than the way people of color are. It's all around us. Once I began to notice, I couldn't unnotice ever again. I saw this subtle and not so subtle racism everywhere that I looked. I began to realize that the reaction that I had had in the elevator that day was not the result of any real-world experience that I had ever had. It was the result of the mental programming I had gotten having lived my entire life swimming in a sea of racist messages that I hadn't even noticed were there. Once I began noticing, I started seeing much worse. I saw racism in government policies. I noticed how insanely segregated the so-called very progressive community that I lived in was. And I noticed how our economic system preys on people of color to keep them trapped in a cycle that steals resources from them and gives it to the already uber wealthy in our society. And then I saw even worse than that. One of my biggest awakenings to the depth and breadth of the systemic racism in America came many years ago when I was called to serve on jury duty. I got seated on a criminal case involving a 16-year-old black kid who was being charged with the theft of a firearm. Because of the seriousness of the crime, he was being charged as an adult. In her opening arguments, a prosecutor for the City of Minneapolis Attorney's Office told the jury that she had an open and shut case. She said that she would prove easily, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the young defendant not only had possession of a stolen gun, but he was the person who had stolen it. She said that she would bring forward a string of expert witnesses, including the law enforcement officers who had arrested the suspect, as well as DNA experts who would definitively prove her case. She emphasized repeatedly that it was an open and shut case. Then the trial went forward. And while the prosecuting attorney did her best to try to string together some kind of cockamamie story involving a stolen gun and this young black defendant, she never came close to proving the defendant ever even saw the gun, much less that he had touched it or stolen it. Her DNA experts only testified that the defendant, quote, couldn't be ruled out for having contributed DNA to the stolen gun. Wait, what? Couldn't be ruled out for having contributed DNA to the gun? What did that even mean? Well, it turned out what it actually meant was that they didn't find the defendant's DNA on the gun. Naturally, the prosecutor didn't want to say it that way. There was, however, a lot of DNA on the gun, from a lot of different people. And because the DNA all mixed together, they couldn't say with 100% certainty that there was no DNA from the defendant on the gun. Upon cross-examination, these DNA experts were forced to admit that about 70% of the world's population, quote, couldn't be ruled out for having contributed DNA to the gun. These DNA experts, I have to emphasize, were the strongest part of the prosecutor's case. It's what she based the whole thing on. In other words, she had no case whatsoever, nothing. To say it one more time, she never showed the defendant had possession of the gun, touched the gun, or even knew the gun existed, much less that he had stolen it. The gun had actually been stolen a year and a half earlier in a city more than 30 miles away. The prosecutor never connected the defendant to the scene of the crime or even to the city where it had been stolen. She had no case. When she wrapped up her case, I was reflecting back on her opening statement, in which she insisted she had an open and shut case, and I honestly felt lied to. She had tried to con the jury into convicting a young black teen for a crime she had no way of connecting him to at all. And she was trying to charge him as an adult in order to give him the maximum penalty. Let that all sink in. When the jury went to deliberate, I was stupidly confident that it would be over easy and fast. After all, we were instructed by the court on multiple occasions to approach this case as though we assumed the defendant was innocent. Our legal system has this thing, called presumption of innocence. It's our job as jurors to determine whether or not the prosecutor had proven her case beyond a reasonable doubt in order to overcome that presumption of innocence. And clearly she hadn't. She had proven nothing. Nothing. Thinking we could likely wrap up the deliberations without a bunch of debate, I asked the jurors right off the bat if they were leaning guilty or not guilty. And I was horrified by the result. The initial vote was 50-50. I mean, I honest to God couldn't wrap my head around it. As debate went on into the evening, I became even more aghast. Jurors were saying things like, quote, "Well, I just think he's guilty, so that's how I'm going to vote." During that evening's deliberation and then into the following morning, myself and a handful of other jurors decided we were going to just do this one basic thing to try to move the conversation. We would simply reread the judge's instructions and ask those people what evidence they saw that proved guilt to them. And none of them were ever able to answer the question. Each time we asked it, they would grow increasingly more irritated and uncomfortable. Eventually, over time, they began one by one changing their votes to not guilty, but whenever they would say something like, "Well, I see your point. The prosecution didn't actually prove it, but I still think he's guilty." Near the end of deliberation, we were down to one remaining holdout, adamantly insisting on a guilty verdict. I asked her one more time if she could explain the piece of evidence that was presented that proved to her the defendant was guilty. When she still couldn't answer, I told her flat out that I planned to sit there and keep asking her until she could answer that question, because if she couldn't answer it, our job was to find the defendant not guilty. At that point, she screamed out, quote, "Obviously he's guilty, just look at him." And there it was. The unspoken racism in the room was finally articulated out loud, and every single one of us in the jury could see it, taste it, and smell it. Even she could smell it. The jury room was utterly silent for several seconds. Then she hung her head and agreed to change her vote to not guilty. We announced the not guilty verdict to the court a little while later. The stench of racism had permeated every inch of that case from its very beginning. The racist jury was only the last stop on a long path that began with an unnecessary traffic stop for driving while black. Okay, that wasn't the reason the cops gave for actually pulling the defendant over. Officially, they said they caught him doing a slow rolling stop. But how many white kids would be pulled over for a slow rolling stop? How many white kids with valid driving credentials and no priors and who were cooperating with police would be removed from their vehicles and searched? How many prosecutors would charge them with crimes they had no evidence of them committing? And how many jurors would vote to convict them? As overt and obvious as the racism in the court and jury room were, few people could actually see it until the very moment that juror blurted out what she had been feeling all along. She was sure he was guilty. Just look at him. The fact of the matter is, we are all a little bit like that juror. We are all racists, born and raised in a racist culture that feeds a non-stop stream of racist messages into our brains every single day. And we have become so acclimated to it that we cannot see it until something shakes us, strips the filters off, and makes us see it. While we are all racists, there are different kinds of racists among us. There are the kinds like I used to be, ignorant, unaware, and just going along with the systemic racism that's all around, oblivious to it because it doesn't really affect us. Then there are those of us who've come to see it and who are doing whatever we can to try to change it, but we're still racists. We can't simply erase an entire lifetime of racist programming. And naturally, There are the racists who see and relish it and work actively to perpetuate it. But just because you're not one of those, don't kid yourself into believing you are not a racist. Because if you've grown up in the United States at any time before now, you've not actively been working to destroy racism, then you are in fact a racist, whether or not you want to see it or admit it. You are the product of a racist system. After more than 400 years or so of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, and more, it is long past time for the United States to put our racist culture behind us, to fulfill the American vision of a fair, just, and equal society. And to do that, we each need to come to terms with our own racial biases. We need to own them, acknowledge them, and then actively work to fix them. If you won't, a racist you will remain, and from this moment on, you can no longer blame the racist culture you grew up in. It's on you. So that's why this old white guy is asking all other old white guys and gals out there to get off their butts and do something about racism. Racism is not a problem created by people of color. They therefore can't fix it. Racism lives inside each of us. We're the ones who have to fix it. If you disagree, tell me what I got wrong in the comments, but I will warn you, most people who try only end up proving my point. And if you agree with me, join me in asking your white family and friends to join the anti-racist movement and like and share this video. Thanks for watching.